The RTX 5070 is due to be released soon, and if the rest of the 50 series is anything to go by, then we already know what to expect. The recent history of this SKU in the GeForce lineup has been riddled with disappointment, with the 2070 rendered irrelevant by the 2060 Super, and the 3070 being sunk by the influence of 16GB consoles on modern game design. Nvidia had been coasting along on 8GB offerings for several years at that point, but by 2023 it wasn't enough. The 4070 broke the cycle and finally brought the bare minimum amount of memory for modern gaming. But is that all it brings? Nvidia aren't stupid. While the company motto does seem to be treat 'em mean, keep 'em keen, they know that eventually they have to stop drip feeding us upgrades, if only to shut us up. And so the big upgrade the 4070 offered people who were considering switching to AMD or Intel alternatives was 12GB of GDDR6X on a 192-bit bus, because when Jensen hands you a gift, you should always look at his other hand to see what he's taking away. According to Tech PowerUp, the 4070 only offers 22% more performance than its immediate predecessor, which actually seems generous in the Blackwell era, but the VRAM was the thing that made this worthwhile. The likes of Plague Tale Requiem, The Last of Us, Ratchet & Clank, among many others, showed that even the most powerful 8GB graphics cards would only be good for medium settings at best, and the game-changing new technologies that Nvidia themselves were championing all required a bigger frame buffer to achieve. Speaking of, the other big headline feature was DLSS 3 frame generation, a technology I never really saw the need for, but which has somehow come to completely change the gaming industry. But not directly. It was, in fact, the open source version from AMD that's made its way into several games lately, and which is being treated as the default option for turning 30 FPS into 60. Which many gamers and content creators disagree with. FrameGen is something I'm in the process of testing for another video on my upcoming second channel, but in my opinion it takes hardware reviews out of the realms of measurable performance and into a more subjective, vibes-based territory, and so for that reason I won't be benchmarking games with FrameGen enabled. The card I have here is the MSI Gaming X Slim version with the controversial 16-pin power connector. Some other 4070s have old school 8-pin connectors, and given this new type's reputation for reliability, or lack thereof, you might want to be on the lookout for the 8-pin kind. Either way, if you don't have a 16-pin cable on your power supply, make sure you get the right adapter. The test platform for this video is my new SVEG, or sensibly priced high-end gaming PC, featuring a Ryzen 7 7800X3D and 32GB of tuned DDR5-6000. I don't expect too many super high frame rate results to crop up in this test, so I would expect mostly similar results from my moderately priced Ryzen 5 setup, but a bunch of people complained that I dared to test the 3080 and 3080 Ti with a 7500F, so here we are. It's my first GPU archive video of 2025, and I already have a few new additions to the benchmark suite. The first of these is Avowed, which was provided free of charge by Xbox, and there's a link to where you can buy one in the description. I personally haven't played much as yet, just far enough to reach the City of Paradise, so I could create a repeatable benchmark run without worrying about cutscenes or combat getting in the way. It's built on UE5, so there's a pretty big difference between the average and percentile lows on all of the benchmark runs. Without ray tracing, the 4070 can manage 90 FPS at 1080p, but drops as low as 60. At 1440p those numbers fall to 69 and 46 respectively. Enabling RT without also enabling DLSS is possible, but not recommended. 1080p's only averaging just over 60 and 1440p's in the mid-40s. Enabling quality DLSS returns most of the lost performance and still looks decent, although I think it's still using the CNN model upscaler, so switching to the new improved Transformer model would look even better. Another new release that some folks think is the saviour of PC gaming Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is, of course, a sequel, but one that's based on the same engine as the original and, if we're being critical, isn't a huge graphical leap for 7 years. That being said, the first game was pretty good looking for its day, and CryEngine's sparse voxel Octree global illumination is a kind of lightweight software alternative to ray-traced global illumination, so you get a lot of the benefits of RTGI, like coloured light bounces and mostly correct indoor lighting. I've gone with the Ultra preset, which results in a solid 80 FPS average at 1080p, but with better frame pacing than Avowed. However, if you're going to play at 1440p, you might want to consider dropping some settings or adding DLSS, as otherwise the average of 55 might not be to your tastes. We're still a few days away from the launch of Monster Hunter Wilds, so for the time being I only have the free benchmark utility to go off of. I don't know what happened to the RE engine. Before last year I associated it with games that were particularly memory intensive but generally pretty smooth performers. First Dragon's Dogma 2 and now this are proving it to be a real mess for PCs. The averages look absolutely fine, with the 1080p and 1440p numbers looking close to those from my KCD2 benchmarks. But that's not completely accurate. The 1080p results drop below 60, and not just in frame time spikes and scene transitions. At 1440p, those lows fall into the mid-40s. My RT test was, if anything, a bit better, due to the fact that I also enabled quality DLSS. This means 1080p hardly drops below 60, and 1440p also only goes as low as the 50s. RT or not, I think DLSS is advisable in this one. Okay, so I caved. I finally put down money on Spider-Man 2. I heard it had a bad launch, so I put off buying it for a few weeks to give them a chance to patch it before I went forming a negative first impression. I've recreated my Spider-Man Remastered benchmark run from Central Park down Broadway to the Flatiron, and in fairness, although there's a broad disparity between averages and percentile lows, that was equally true of the first game. Traversal stutter just seems to be part of the deal, and to be equally fair, I was surprised just how big of a visual difference there is in this game from its predecessor. At 1080p very high, frames are high enough that an older CPU might just become the limiting factor, but locking to 60 FPS should be pretty smooth. At 1440p the average is in the mid-70s, but lows are a mere 41. Again, I compensated with quality DLSS for my ray-traced run, and that saw 1080p drop to 80 FPS, and at 1440p I had my second soixante nerf of the day. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a rare example of a game in 2025 which doesn't use any kind of ray tracing, though given its PS5 origins that's perhaps less surprising. It's also reflected in some of the user experience, which is very much the kind of thing thrown together by developers who aren't used to working on PC. Like, for example, the lack of proper full screen mode means that changing resolution means changing the desktop resolution. Nevertheless, this isn't bad performance, even though frame pacing isn't exactly impressive. My benchmark run was actually more of a walk through the first village area in the game, and that saw an average of 100 FPS at 1080p. So again, an older generation CPU might not see all of that performance. At 1440p the average is close to 80, but now the lows have tumbled down below 50. There's no escaping ray tracing in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, but there are degrees of RT involved. At base settings, the game has RTGI, but leaves stuff like shadows to rasterization, and so performance is actually excellent on the 4070. The average at 1080p Very Ultra, seriously, who comes up with these names, passes 100, and at 1440p it still maintains an ultra acceptable 77 FPS. I wouldn't be inclined to try pushing any higher than this, as the menu gives a VRAM warning when trying to enable Supreme mode. I'm also not sure how much room there is for full RT either. With path tracing maxed out, DLSS quality isn't enough to reach 60 at 1080p, or even 30 at 1440p, so unless you want to try enabling one or two of your favourite RT effects, I'd say sticking with the regular RTGI would be the best overall experience. Two things I know about Dragon Age Veilguard. 1, a lot of old school Dragon Age fans don't like it very much, and 2, a lot of bigger channels than mine say it's a surprisingly well optimised game by modern standards. I don't like to flood my benchmarks with stutterfests if I can help it, so for now it seems like a good fit. At 1080p the average is once more over 100 FPS, and at 1440p it's still running well above 60 across the board. Enabling RT and quality DLSS does virtually nothing to performance overall, and that's even including the new transformer model. I'm carrying over God of War Ragnarok into my 2025 videos, mainly because it's another popular non-RT title and I like to keep a little balance, even though I actually think RT is a good thing overall. More on that in a future video. Again, the 4070 handles both 1080p and 1440p without resorting to upscaling. At 1080p Ultra, it can average well over 100 FPS, with lows around the high 70s. And at 1440p, the 88 FPS average and 63 1% lows are all very playable. Another non-RT title that's sticking around for a while is Horizon Forbidden West. The section I use for benchmarking is not part of the Burning Shores expansion area, which I hear can be a bit more intensive than the rest of the game. However, we still have plenty of room at 1080p, with a 102 FPS average and lows in the mid-70s. 1440p might warrant some upscaling, as even in this section of the game the 1% do fall below the 60 mark. Ubisoft's latest games heavily integrate ray tracing, and as they're doing so using different engines from other publishers, that makes them worth talking about. Even if nobody actually plays their games anymore, playing Star Wars Outlaws without DLSS then feels like deliberately tying one hand behind my back. At native 1080p high, the average is sub 60 FPS, and even dropped to medium, there are moments where it falls into the 50s. I did enable DLSS for the direct RT tests, and it actually offsets the performance loss perfectly, only dropping averages by a few frames at most. But you might still want to be a bit more adventurous with upscaling, especially at 1440p. Black Myth Wukong is one of last year's UE5 games that uses Lumen as standard, as well as having the option of full path tracing. In fairness, the game's rasterized shadows can be distracting as hell, so I'd love to be able to recommend path tracing on the 4070, but I don't think I can. Without full RT enabled, the 4070 really doesn't need to resort to any kind of DLSS, with 1080p passing 90 FPS and 1440p still over 60, but if you want path tracing, you might also have to add more upscaling than I'm comfortable recommending. At DLSS quality, specifically the 65% scaling mark, 1440p only averages 45 FPS, and the 1% lows are in the mid-30s. You could always enable frame generation, but that does incur additional latency, and in this style of game that might not be an acceptable compromise. I'm afraid if you want path tracing at 1440p, you might want to hold out for a 4080 instead. Rather than drop the now 4-year-old Cyberpunk 2077 from my benchmark lineup altogether, this year I'm compromising. The game stays, but I'm using the built-in benchmark. This can be a bit less CPU intensive than my old custom test run, but it's also much quicker to run and doesn't get interrupted by Arasaka bastards. At ultra settings, the game runs at a perfectly decent 120 FPS at native 1080p, and a still acceptable 70 plus at 1440p, though with several dips into the 50s. Given how path tracing worked out in Indiana Jones and Black Myth Wukong, I've stuck with the RT Ultra preset and quality DLSS using the transformer model, which results in a small drop off at 1080p and almost no loss at 1440p. Another RT exclusive, Stalker 2 was patched recently to fix a bunch of known issues, and while I haven't done a before and after to see how much this patch affects benchmarks, you probably shouldn't compare these numbers to any of my previous videos. This game can be pretty noisy, and leaving DLAA turned on helps clear that up somewhat without massively impacting performance, but I think it still might be worth stepping down to DLSS quality. Without it, 1080p is largely playable at 79 FPS on average and lows in the 50s, and while 1440p still holds around 60 on average, the frame pacing isn't brilliant. I found a new, faster benchmark run in Alan Wake 2 this year that doesn't involve hearing the same dozen or so voice lines over and over, so again, don't compare these numbers to any of my previous ones, as it might not be a fair comparison. It's still a pretty intensive benchmark, with the flashlight enabled to add some extra work for the lighting system to do. At 1080p high, the average falls below 60 FPS, so you might want to consider dropping to medium. At 1440p, I don't think it's advisable playing without DLSS, as the average is now down to just 43. Again, path tracing is a bit too much to ask of the 4070, and with quality DLSS, 1080p still falls below 50 on average, and 1440 is barely a 30 FPS experience. I'll be dropping The Last of Us Part 1 from my GPU test lineup this year, especially with the sequel just around the corner, but I thought I'd give it one last run as the game that officially made me give up on the RTX 3070. My test run is just long enough that it picks up one or two noticeable dips, perhaps from data being loaded into memory, so 1% lows are never going to be perfect, but overall the 4070 seems sufficient for a smooth experience. At 1080 Ultra, the average just hits 100 FPS, with lows over 80. At 1440, I didn't have to make any quality compromises, like I would on this card's predecessor, and it can still push 70 FPS, and stays above 60 most of the time. I'm a bit conflicted about my Marvel Rivals benchmark. I tested at two different resolutions and two different quality settings, and I wanted to get a consistent result to meaningfully reflect the difference in settings. Rather than roll the dice on which map I got thrown into each time, I instead went through the training mission, which has only one player character and a handful of mobs to shoot at. At 1080 Ultra without ray tracing, I saw 133 FPS and almost 90 FPS at 1440p. Turning on RT would normally require some DLSS, but I actually found the results weren't too bad without it, with 1080p still averaging over 100 FPS and 1440p passing 70. Low enough that DLSS wouldn't be a bad idea, but high enough that it's not a necessity. Alas, these consistent numbers don't reflect a real game, and the one match I did benchmark, at 1440p with RT enabled, scored about 10% lower than the tutorial. Wait, what's this old thing doing here? Arkham Knight was released on PC a decade ago, and the massive performance issues it was plagued with at launch should have all been resolved by now. How could this possibly be relevant in 2025? Actually, if you've been paying attention to the news around the RTX 50 series launch, you'll know that one of the smaller controversies around this new arch is that it no longer supports 32-bit physics, which means older games that use this physics simulation model will perform massively worse on the latest graphics cards than on older ones. Now, you can always turn physics off, so as far as I know, most of these games aren't becoming unplayable, and perhaps there'll be official or community mods, but for now, it's one more thing to keep the RTX 40 series relevant. The game is capped to 90 FPS, but the built-in benchmark is uncapped and features a bunch of physics effects. Both 1440p and 4K should run the game at its maximum frame rate, though both games will probably have the occasional stutter. The RTX 4070 is still a viable gaming GPU for 1080p and 1440p in 2025, 90% of the time. There's a couple of instances where it falls short, notably in Alan Wake 2 and Star Wars Outlaws, but those are also games that have notoriously not sold very well, so you might not see that as a problem. You're also not going to be able to max out ray tracing, especially in games that offer path tracing, and considering the new price on this graphics card is still on par with a decent quality TV, something you'd normally expect to last a good few years, you might think that's unacceptable. The 4070 does give you tools to help mitigate the problems I just mentioned. Deep Learning Supersampling's new transformer model is better quality than ever before, with very little impact on performance, meaning you could potentially be far more aggressive with DLSS than I've been in this video. Frame generation is also there, And if you can tolerate the additional input delay it causes and the risk of visual artifacts it poses, you can pretty much ignore my warnings about games being too demanding or settings you should steer clear of. Even if you are an advocate of using technology like upscaling and motion smoothing to overcome hardware limitations, the key question of the 4070 is still value. There are several cards in this same class. The 4070 Super is about 16% faster, which is apparently what we call a generational improvement these days, and the cheapest Super is only about 10% more expensive than the cheapest non-Super. Normally I'd say you're more likely to find a good deal on a used 4070 rather than a 4070 Super due to its age, but the second-hand market is acting weird again, and it's hard to predict what's going on right now. Meanwhile, from AMD, you could conceivably pick up a more powerful, but more power-hungry card, like the RX 7800 XT or 6900 XT for a similar price. You're still not going to be able to properly enjoy path tracing. In fact, RT performance overall is going to be a bit worse too. And you're probably not going to get FSR 4 either, so the 4070 will have the edge in upscaling quality. What the Radeons do have going for them, however, is VRAM. And that's the one thing counting against the RTX 4070 in this context. The elephant in the room. 12GB is now widely regarded as the new minimum, at least for people who want to play modern games at high settings, and if you're the kind of person who upgrades a lot, then maybe that's okay. Maybe next time you'll get a 16GB card that'll last a bit longer. Maybe Nvidia will deliver on the promise of the Blackwell launch, and these new neural shaders will radically shrink texture sizes, so GPUs don't need as much VRAM. But, assuming that's not the case, 12GB might not be enough in a couple of years' time. Hell, for games like Indiana Jones, it's not really enough now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.